One.
Hello there, guys. Welcome to the Daily Objective. Today I've got James with me. Today we're going to be discussing kind of the idea about defeating your enemy and how you need to defeat your enemy psychologically with overwhelming force. And this is on the back of an interview that was done by a former Lebanese minister, where he was talking about the idea of whether the attacks from Hezbollah have eased the pressure on Gaza, which is apparently what they intended to do. And he commented that actually that the Hamas and Hezbollah forces are tired, they're worn out, and that this and people are taking this as an indication that actually Israel is succeeding in the task of overwhelming its enemy. So that's what we're going to talk about. But first, we have the news update as usual. So we're in day 69 of the war. The death toll, as it stands at the moment for Israeli soldiers since the ground operation started, has raised to 117 soldiers. That's reflecting the trend that we've seen basically in the last week or so, where fighting has intensified, particularly in certain areas of the north and particularly in the south around Khan Yunis. For most of the first part of the war, the death toll was going up by very small amounts, but actually I think probably if you plotted it on a graph, we've seen a huge spike in deaths of Israeli soldiers, unfortunately. Aside from that, things which were in the headlines were that the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, was stopped by the head of the Israeli war cabinet from traveling to Qatar to negotiate another hostage exchange. Benny Gantz also commented that Israel needs to find another opportunity to renew the peace process. And basically what's been shown is that there's division in the Israeli cabinet about this, because Netanyahu and the defense minister Gallant have pushed back about this and think that it need to wait further for Hamas to be further demoralized before they do anything like that. Denmark has arrested 7 terrorists, which are supposedly acting on behalf of Hamas, which was done with the aid of the Mossad, which is interesting to see that actually the Hamas operatives are expanding outwards. I think that kind of goes to something we were talking about on the show in recent weeks, that actually, although I think people's attitude in the West is that Hamas is a kind of agent which is localized to that kind of area of the world, actually they're probably spreading out much further, and the ramifications of their actions will be much further, particularly in relation to Europe. And then also the Hamas official, I think I'm going to read this out because I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but it's Musa Abu Marzouk, on Thursday released a statement where he backtracked on comments where he said that Hamas should recognize Israel's existence to end conflict within the PLO, so within the kind of internal factional groups within the Palestinian organizations between Hamas and all these people. So those are the things which dominated the headlines. And on to the main topic. So James, we saw this interview where the Lebanese minister is commenting that he's tired. Just introduce the topic. Why is it important, in a sense, that you need to overwhelm your enemy and defeat them psychologically? Why is that an important kind of thing?
People make much of technology and strategy, and people will cite Sun Tzu's Art of War, and they will go on about all the things that make a war successful. But you know something? The single most important factor is psychology. The single most important factor in war is morale. I cannot emphasize this strongly enough. I really cannot. The examples in history, as a historian, the examples in history are numerous. 300 Spartans held off tens of thousands of Persians. I know this is going back to ancient history, quite a ways. But as in the ancient world, as the ancient Persians were invading Greece, they were held back by a small group of people who had it's true that they found the right place, a narrow pass where a small group of people could actually hold off thousands of invading soldiers. But so overwhelmed in the numbers were the Greeks that it is absolutely remarkable that they were able to hold off the Persian, at the time, by ancient standards especially, the vast, overwhelming numbers from the Persians. Consider Winston Churchill. What he gave to the Allies during World War II cannot be measured. It really cannot be measured. The eloquence with which he kept. Consider, as civilians during World War II are being hammered in southern England, as London is being devastated by these rockets coming from the Nazis, it is absolutely vital that morale on the part of the West be kept up. And part of the heroism, frankly, of Winston Churchill for all of the Allies When he talks about the surviving at Dunkirk, boy, talk about a foolish thing Hitler did in allowing so many British soldiers to escape at the start of the war. But if you could say, never have so many owed so much to so few, right? Things like that, really. And then, or you look at the other side. Think of suicide as a strategy, and it certainly is a strategy on the part of the weaker side, often in war. And they're doing it precisely because of psychological reasons. Suicide has been used, the kamikazes during World War II, for example. The idea is psychological. The impact is supposed to be psychological on the enemy. See, we're willing to die. We're willing to throw our young men's lives away just like that without even thinking about it if we can take out an American naval ship. That's a psychological intimidation tactic. But it's a tactic. If they didn't think it would work, they would stop doing that. Even the worst mystic, even the worst collectivist is using it for practical purposes. If there are many of us who would be willing to risk our lives, even die, if it meant that our family would survive. If it meant that my wife and my children would survive, I would risk or even give my life if I knew that would happen. And that, I think, is the actual psychology of the suicidal types. One of the great ironies of history is that back when the Jews were fighting the ancient Romans, the Roman Empire, 2,000 years ago, in great wars, the wars that reduced the temple to the Wailing Wall it is today, really huge wars by ancient standards, it was a losing affair. The Jews were never going to defeat the Roman war machine of the first century. I don't think anyone on the planet at the time could defeat the Roman war machine in the first century. So what did they use? They used suicide tactics, very much like Muslim suicide bombers today. It did not work. The Romans were not intimidated by the psychology factor there. If you were going to commit suicide, okay, we're not going to stop us. So the Romans, in facing that suicidal attitude, or let's say the Americans and British in facing the kamikazes of Japan, you can defeat it. It's psychological. They're doing it for a real practical reason. They're not just people don't just throw their lives away to no end. Bringing it full circle here. Yeah, Lebanon's a mess. And you hear the interview and the guy saying, look, we can't run a country in Lebanon. It's disrupting life in Lebanon. How are we supposed to continue to live? Well, that's a good point there, sir. If this is a perpetual war with Israel, it's sure going to make life in southern Lebanon unlivable for the people there. Let me suggest that this is even true of Gaza and Hamas. If they did not think that this would work, if they didn't think that they could play to the international press, if they didn't think they could use our morality against us, they would not do that. There will come a point, if they believe that the West is consistent, if they believe the West will not back down against their psychology tactics, they will get tired. They will get tired of their young people dying in suicide missions to no end. And, really, when someone is acting that extreme, showing that, look, we don't care, we're willing to throw our lives away for this, the correct response is yes, we'll help you throw just as many lives away as you want. And until and unless the responsive attitude is that, you're not going to get any action. On the other hand, you will. If they believe that it won't result in any practical benefit to them, they will stop killing their own young people at some point. Believe me, they may have mystical motives, they may have collectivist motives, they may be deeply entrenched in altruism, which permits them to be martyrs in a way that even rational people, it's like I say, I'd risk my life for my own family. Perfectly rational, I think. These people are willing to risk their lives and give them away because they believe in paradise or believe in this collectivism that makes them superior to, say, the Jews. But no matter how irrational, no matter how mystical, no matter how altruistic, no matter how collectivistic you are in your motivation, which might make you really foolishly suicidal, it's still a tactic, ladies and gentlemen. And if it really didn't work, they wouldn't just be self-immolating constantly if there was no end. And what you hear here is really interesting. We're tired. That word, it's everything in war. It's everything in war. Look, Tokyo Rose would not have been making her broadcasts to undermine the morale of Allied fighters in the Pacific if the Japanese didn't think morale was important. We wouldn't have had radio-free Europe all that time when the Soviet Empire was there if we didn't know that morale was important. Morale is, at the end of the day, more important than weapons technology. Let me just say that outright. Way more important, far, far more important. You see, the weapons are useless if you're not willing to use them. It's your willingness to use them. Your determination against in this fight against evil is not going to work unless you really are determined and are aware that this is a fight against evil. For so many decades, intellectuals in the West thought the Soviet Union was a noble moral experiment under communism. But the second that Western leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan stood up and said, no, these are the bad guys. Reagan said this is an evil empire. We went through Soviet premiers until we got to Gorbachev, and then Lady Thatcher finally said, this is a guy we can work with. And it was only the tough backbone, I'm critical of Reagan for other reasons, but it was only the tough backbone of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And look, not a single American or British life was lost and the Soviet empire collapsed, just as Ayn Rand had predicted. Morale is everything. How did the Soviet empire simply collapse? They had nuclear weapons. They're a nuclear-armed empire. And yet, in the early 1990s, they completely fell apart, simply because the West stood up with some moral backbone. Morale is everything in war.
Absolutely. And although I think the nature of war is such that we can reach back to ancient Greece for examples, there's plenty of good ones in the 20th century. So I think Churchill's a very good one, as you mentioned, on the side in the sense of continuing a war, in the sense of a positive source of morale. Because I don't know how much this is known outside of the UK, it probably is, but just how desperate the situation in the UK was, and just how close the UK came to falling. I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head. I wish I had it, but the number of fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns that were in the UK at a certain point, I think in 1940, reached almost single figures, like a scarily low amount.
Terrifying.
And then the claiming of things.
The power of the Nazi war machine at the time, even against Great Britain at the time, these guys had the most accurate missiles, and they were intentionally aiming them at civilians in London. I mean, talk about a vicious policy, and designed to undermine morale, the Allies' morale. I mean, the stories, I remember my grandmother telling me stories about World War II and the horrors, even in America, that we had for British civilians in southern England who were being devastated at the time, hiding in the tube tunnels from Nazi bombing. And it was a psychological tactic. It was designed to have that effect. And the minute that the American government found that the Nazis were working on a nuclear bomb, the one plus one was put together. It was immediately, American policymakers immediately saw that if Hitler got the bomb, London would be no more. We had to start working on a nuclear bomb. And it was that exact context and situation that so motivated Americans to develop the nuclear bomb. Hitler had no compunction about devastating civilians. What if he had a nuclear bomb with the accurate missiles he had? He would have wiped out civilians without hesitation. And that's what really compelled America to try and develop a nuclear weapon. Morale is everything, because notice what happened with the nuclear bomb. Another great example, it was the psychological impact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that caused the very, very fanatical, one might put it, devotion to the Japanese emperor on the part of so many Shinto Japanese. They finally broke psychologically, and it is the psychological breaking that is the key. At the end of the day, that probably saved lives, those nuclear bombs, but only because the morale, the psychology of the Shinto Japanese was broken at the time, if that makes sense. Another example. In fact, every war is almost like this. Again and again and again, you can cite examples. It's the side that has the willingness to keep going. That is, if you don't have the willingness to keep going, you're lost. If you don't have that, everything else is unimportant. Like I say, you could have the superior technology. Obviously, Israel has the superior technology, the superior missiles, the superior aircraft. They could devastate and wipe out Gaza. It is that hesitation. It is that hesitation, the degree of that hesitation, that the bad guys are measuring. Trust me, they are measuring that very willingness. They are perfectly aware of the situation.
Yes, and so there's World War II and Churchill for a good example of the importance of morale for continuing a war. But even in the First World War, I think Germany is a good example there as well, because although the German leadership clearly had their morale broken and so surrendered, the German soldiers did not, because an important part of what then leads to the Second World War, not the sole cause, but is the fact that the soldiers in the spring offensive thought, we're almost at Paris, we're almost winning, why are you resigning? So psychologically, they still wanted to go on.
Many this Germans, is what, yes.
And this is what drives attraction to the far-right movements in the 30s, because they have this stabbed in the back myth that goes on. So they weren't psychologically defeated.
Precisely correct. So many Germans believed that it was the failure of the willingness of the Kaiser's government to do what it took. We could have taken Paris. We could have won that war. It didn't need to be such a long stalemate. In fact, even when the Americans got involved, we could have done better. No, a lot of Germans had this attitude that we were stabbed in the back, and that's what led to far-right politics 10 years later in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think the idea that Hamas could be psychologically defeated, I have to say, just in terms of me thinking about it until, I guess, seeing some of this, is it feels almost impossible, just in the sense that their devotion to, I guess, to their mission of destroying Israel, it's on the metaphysical level, it's a commandment from God. So the idea that they could be worn out, I think, can feel a bit like, how are they ever going to do that? Basically, total destruction is what's needed, in the sense of they're never going to surrender. But then
get sucked into it. We think, oh, they're so fanatical that they'll go down to the last man. No. It is a tactic. And these folks are interesting too, because they believe in an all-powerful God. And Allah really does control things in a way even more than standard Christian theology has it. Allah is the one who decides victory. And I'd be happy to demonstrate Allah's on our side for them. If they want a demonstration of whose side Allah's on, I could give them that demonstration and be happy to. That would break them. That would stop them. What had tamed them to the degree that they had been tamed before? The willingness of the West to utterly see. Back when the Western civilization was much more Christian and much more violent and much less inhibited about going after the Muslims were tamed to that extent, weren't they? And no, it's all a function of psychology.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to remember about the Japan example, as you mentioned, because they also had a kind of death cult around the emperor, which had the commandment to keep fighting, in a sense, on that same almost metaphysical level. And yet, of course, they were defeated. So it's important to keep that in mind. Right. There was a couple of super chats. So we've got $4.99 from Gail Parker. Thank you very much, Gail. And $2 from Frank Grail, who said, "Today, George Washington died. How was he as a general?" I presume that's in history he died today. And we have 99 cents from Bonnie. So what do you think of him as a general, James?
Oh my gosh, George Washington, another great. You just dip your finger into any piece of the history of warfare to realize that psychology is all. The British, in the late 18th century, the British were one of the great world powers. They maybe had the best army in the world. They certainly had the best navy in the world. And here's the little colonists. And what are they going to do? Their strategy is pure guerrilla warfare. George Washington is basically spending 90% of the revolution fleeing from the British army. The American Revolutionary Army is basically on the run from, just don't let the British army catch up to us to wipe us out, until he finally got the French Navy to help, and finally they could engineer one victory at Yorktown, and the Americans win. But it was sheer psychology against a much, much greater military power. They made the colonies ungovernable for the British, and that's key too. But you see, guerrilla warfare, how does guerrilla warfare ever work? But if you think of the same guerrilla tactics, though, translated into Ireland, not until the 20th century did they really have that effect on the British Empire. Or the guerrilla tactics in the 18th century, when the Scots were revolting against the Hanoverians, finally put down the Stuarts at the Battle of Culloden. What was it? What motivated the Scots? this sense of nationalism for the Stuarts. And what motivated the others? Well, no. We're not going to let your guerrilla warfare stop us one little bit. It was the willingness of the British Army to do what it took to suppress Scottish independence or Irish independence in the 18th century. And so you see it very plainly over and over and over again. Boy, you never run out of examples. It all go all the way back to the ancient Jews. When the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, 2,600 years ago, you're monotheistic Jews, right? And these are polytheistic idol worshipping Babylonians. If we lose to the Babylonians, it can't be that God is rewarding. We believe in the one all-powerful God. So if we lose, if we get defeated, we must have failed God somehow. And that's exactly how Jewish literature interprets it. We became idol worshippers. We let down God on the covenant of Moses, and therefore we deserve to get sacked by these pagan polytheistic Babylonians. Boom. The same kind of logic is going to apply here, ladies and gentlemen, with the jihadists. If Allah is defeating them, then Allah is... all we have to do is win, ladies and gentlemen, and show the willingness to fight and win. Yes.
And I probably know less about George Washington than you do, but when we studied the Revolutionary War at school, I remember studying the course of it, and one of the questions my teacher posed was, in a sense, how did this much smaller force defeat the British Empire, the kind of biggest empire in the world? And literally, we did very deep kind of studies of some of the generals like James Wolfe, who is decorated and buried in Westminster Abbey and all this stuff. How does a general like that get defeated? And it's a good question. And
good question.
I don't know if I have the full answer for people, but I remember when we looked at Valley Forge, for example, and Washington's leadership there. Valley Forge isn't a battle against an enemy; it's a battle against psychological endurance and morale, getting through that winter. And so that there's a good example there, I think, of the importance of morale and psychology in war, and resisting that so that they can continue fighting rather than being defeated. So that would be the example for Washington, I think, that I would point to.
Great example, and the Revolutionary War is full of them. Those are the American patriotism gets all warm and fuzzy when it think of the endurance and the bravery and those men were willing to take on. See, it's the psychology. If they're committed to their cause in such a way, think of the Patrick Henry and the Virginia legislature. I do not know what course other men may choose, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. You see, he's taking that. This is a life and death stance for me. Hamas is taking that. This is a life and death stance for me. We have to respond with, this is a life or death stance for me. And we have not done that. The minute you do that, you've won, in effect. And the other guy breaks, he's not willing to do whatever it takes, you've won. It's now just a matter of time and detail how it plays out. But the guy who psychologically surrenders is lost. The guy who's willing to do what it takes, he's won. And that comes down to moral clarity about what you're doing.
For sure. And the Churchill example, again, I guess, is a good one in the sense that there's a lot of controversy about Churchill recently, I guess, as part of kind of contemporary iconoclasm, because people want to kind of tear him down as a symbol. And very often, some of the things they'll say aren't factually false. They'll bring up unsavory opinions he had about different races or things that he did when he was in charge of the Navy and all this stuff. And factually, not a lot of them are false, but is motivated by an attempt to tear down a symbol, right? And why do people want to cling to the image of Churchill? Partly because they want to defend a hero, which I think is perfectly fair, but also because the morale boost which he provided during the Second World War was so important that whatever else flaws he had, and a lot of them are perfectly, they're very much there. They were very much part of it. He was a mixed figure in certain respects, but the importance of the moral boost that he was giving to the country and the leadership that he gave to the country was very, very important.
Crucial. The courage of the monarchs. Now, I'm a Republican in my politics. If I was a British subject, I'd be a Republican, I admit it. But I have to admit that the royal family's own courage through this. King George VI refused to leave London even as the missiles were dropping. And they asked the Queen Elizabeth at the time, why did you take the children and go to Scotland or Canada or someplace safer? And she said, no, my place is here with my husband. My children's place is here with me, and my place is here with my husband. And we're going to stay in London no matter how many bombs. See, if you'd had that psychological attitude, just that the royal family had, no, we're going to stick here. We're going to stay here, and we're going to, even if it risks our lives, the lives of the royal family, we're going to stay here in London. Now, I have to say, it's little things like that that make huge difference when it comes to war. It's that willingness to do what it takes. It's that courage in the face of it. Look at D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. In that case, the Americans did take the brunt of the casualties because they landed on the wrong part of the beach. That's where the resistance was. But consider the willingness of America to take all the casualties it took on D-Day and Normandy. Now that's it. The Allies are going to get a beachhead in the continent of Europe. That's it. And even if it means, now I think we could have had a better, we could argue the tactics of D-Day. I think the tactics of D-Day can be very, very much argued and debated. Did we need to lose so many young lives when Normandy was invaded, especially American lives that day? I think that's very debatable. On the other hand, look at the willingness of the Allies. It showed that the Americans and the British were willing to take a huge punch and still keep going, Mr. Hitler. We're going to keep fighting and do what it takes. Once you deliver that message, it's amazing how the psychology crumbles. Once that last winter offensive by Hitler at the Battle of the Bulge was defeated, boom, the psychology of the Nazis was shattered. And it was really only a matter of weeks before the entire Third Reich had collapsed. It's a matter of psychology.
Absolutely. And it goes to Netanyahu's credit for all else that I think he's rightly criticized for, and hopefully once this conflict's been put to bed, he'll be replaced. It goes to his credit that in the news story that there was there today, that he was saying to the members of his cabinet that before any kind of negotiations can go on, he wants to wait further so that Hamas gets more desperate, which is, morale, psychologically desperate. Now it's in the context of peace negotiations, but he's at least recognizing the importance of psychology to this. And that's why it's so important. And it's encouraging to see, in a sense, that they are tired, because that's, the first domino that falls, and then the rest of them go. Anything final to say, James, just before we wrap up?
Well, I think it's a very good sign that they're tired. And if they don't help, if Hezbollah does start pulling its punches in the north, that'll give Israel a better chance. So let's cross our fingers and let's hope that there's been enough standing up on the part of the West and Israel to cause this to have a positive turn. But see, just that comment, we're tired. We're tired. That says it all.
Absolutely. So we're going to wrap the show up. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. At 6 o'clock, so in I think about 2 minutes, we've got the reality show. So please stick around and join us. But thank you so much for chatting with me, James. Always a pleasure. And we'll see everyone in just a few minutes.